How's it going, Chess College? Hope you're doing well. We're winding down the semester. It is Thursday, the 9th of May. Hope you're getting your papers done. I'm going to post all the papers been posted. Everything's due. And I'm going to open up the reflection journal today. And you can hand that in starting right now to the end of the semester. Um, and that'll be it. We're going to wind down rock and roll right now. The decades, going through it quick. I think I finished in the 60s. It was a tumultuous year. We have the war raging in Vietnam. We got civil rights raging on the streets. We got assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And there's rage in the streets, a very unpopular president in the White House, and by the name of Richard Nixon. And rock and roll is more powerful than ever before for the generation that was born essentially in the 50s. And huge festivals like Monterey Pop Festival and Woodstock were gathering places for what was going to change the world, the hippies, peace and love, and another way of looking at the world. Instead of going to war, we're going to try to figure out how to deal with that, all of that. John Lennon was singing, "Let's give peace a chance." We haven't done that yet. Just a chance. He didn't say, "Let's have peace now." He said, "Let's give it a chance." It didn't happen, and he was killed for his endeavors. That's where peace led him to some maniac wanting to take his life. And so his life was taken with a handgun, and we have more handguns today than ever before. Anyway, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the 80s, folks. The 60s are winding down. Um, the drugs are changing. It went from marijuana to LSD to now we're starting to get into some dangerous drugs like cocaine, some darker drugs. Heroin's always been there, but in a small way, but now it's getting more popular. And then the 60s wind down with the Sharon Tate murders by Charles Manson and his happy-go-lucky, peaceful hippies. And then in December, the Rolling Stones threw a festival in Altamont, California, Altamont Speedway down here, Central California, and James Meredith was murdered by the Hells Angels, and that kind of um, put a closure on the '60s. The hippie dream kind of died with Charles Manson, and the murder at Altamont Speedway. It was no longer peace and love. It was a lot of rage out there. Um, so when the decade opened up to the '70s, the bands were different. It was kind of heavier music for a while. Bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin were ruling the airwaves and the concert halls. People were looking for heavy music, and then there was the Laurel Canyon folk rock scene with led by Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and Jackson Brown and the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt. It was a huge, huge phenomenon in on Laurel Canyon in Upper Sunset Strip. If you've ever been down there, you should take a drive up there. Uh, Tons of people lived up there because it was cheap. It's only about 5 miles, 3, 4 miles down to the Sunset Strip where they played in the nightclubs like the Whiskey a Go Go and the Troubadour, Pandora's Box, the Doors, the Birds, Love. And so it was pretty harmonious for a while in those 70s. It looked like there could be some hope out there. But then we have heavy metal, and they weren't calling it heavy metal yet, but heavy music like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, and then there was the lighter stuff like Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young and James Taylor. Um, that was very, very popular, and you could like both. And it was pretty harmonious for a while. People were getting along, things were going along. The city that became popular in that era was Los Angeles, because that's where Laurel Canyon was in the Sunset Strip. San Francisco became popular in the '60s because of Haight Ashbury. Before that was New York City, Detroit, where the Stooges came from, and the MC5 and the heavier bands like that popped out of that area. There's always been areas where music bands thrived, a style of music thrived. In the '70s, right in the middle of the '70s, this thing called disco appeared, and made popular by the Bee Gees and Donna Summer and Casey and the Sunshine Band and the rest, because of a movie, that John Travolta starred in, uh, Saturday Night Fever, and it was huge. I mean, a phenomenon huge, and that became kind of the song of music of choice for more or less Middle America. Places like Studio 54 were thriving. You go there to dance to this kind of music, take a lot of drugs to that kind of music. All sorts of kooky, wacky stuff was happening. And this is when I lost interest in music personally, because it just didn't seem authentic or real to me. It seemed kind of phony and like entertainment, a bunch of rich people uh, doing cocaine. And in that little mix, there was a little nightclub in New York City in Hell's Kitchen called CBGB, and bands like Television, Talking Heads, Patti Smith, the Ramones um, started playing there to small crowds. Real music, short songs like they had in the '60s. We would call them garage music. They weren't heavy metal. It wasn't heavy like Led Zeppelin and uh, those bands. It was more short, sharp, authentic songs played simply. Wasn't complicated like the progressive rock of the '70s, like bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and ELO were playing very complicated chord structures that a lot of people can play. Everybody could play till the Ramones. If you knew two chords and you had a shitty guitar, you could play punk rock. And it became the savior of the music industry. And it bumped disco out of the public eye, and it thrived in New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and then also in England, where bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash, the Slits, the Raincoats started happening. Um, the punk in the America was really based on more an artistic expression of dissatisfaction with the status quo. And in England, it was a political bend. They were going through tough times, lots of unemployment. No kids didn't have a way to get jobs or loans or buy a house. And punk addressed that. Uh, Bands like the Buzzcocks and Sham 69 made it the rage palatable, and you could go to a gig, see the Clash and Sex Pistols, and have a sense of rage, and you got your young rage out through the energy of the music, and that was really important. It was a cathartic moment of some kind of transcendence, and went out to the West Coast to LA. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. Bands like X and Fear and and the Dickies. Believe it or not, the Go Go's, before they became popular, they were a punk band. Um, Black Flag, Minutemen. Um, all of a sudden, LA had its own scene, different kind of. It's different from New York. It's different from uh, the rage in London, but it is punk all the same. And I went to quite a few shows there. Great bands like the Gun Club and Christine, the Divine Horsemen, the Flesh Eaters. It was an incredible scene. Alice Bag. Um, there were women, there were men. Um, the Germs with Darby Crash was getting headlines, local headlines. They didn't bust too much out of LA area, and but there was a lot of pain and suffering, a lot of heroin use. It was a dark scene. Um, Punk is kind of not a happy music, but it makes people happy to participate in it. Then you start dancing to it. At first, it was called pogoing, it's jumping up and down in front of the stage. Then it became slam dancing. Then it became crashing into your partner and became the mosh pit, which got dangerous, especially when the Orange County skinheads invaded the Hollywood nightclubs with their kind of neo-Nazi rage, male rage, lots of testosterone, lots of people beating up on each other. Cops had to shut down a lot of shows. Some bands like the Circle Jerks and Black Flag, the cops wouldn't allow them to play places because the violence that ensued because of that. Youth has a lot of rage in it, especially when the times are kind of they're not the '60s anymore, folks. The hippie dream had died. The draft was still going on. You could still get drafted and go to Vietnam. That didn't end until seven. Well, that ended in '75, but you had these young people who were still trying to find their place in the world. And punk was a place. It was a collective. It was a group. We still didn't have a political voice out in the world. We could barely get a job. So there was a lot of mistrust of the government and police, and it showed. And yet, some bands survived the '70s into the '80s, and it became a form of music called new wave. Bands like Blondie and the Nerves and the Beat were coming out um, with this kind of more poppy sound with sort of a punk attitude, but more of a pop sound. My Sharona by the Knack was a huge hit, very much like a Beatles song, but with a this new kind of punk attitude. And they called it new wave. The big new wave bands, some of the biggest ones were probably the Motels. This is LA now. New York would be Blondie for sure. They became hugely popular because they had attractive frontmen and women who became kind of sex symbols of the day, and the music was rocking. It was still it was still basically good rock and roll, not the big puffy progressive rock of this or disco, which we're glad to be rid of. In the '80s, also introduced bands without guitars like the Thompson Twins, Boy George, Flock of Seagulls, and all led by the keyboard. The synthesizer became a huge, huge influence, and bands like hmm, some of them are still playing to this day. I'm drawing a blank right now. Uh, they became very popular, had big hits, um, melodic hits, but it wasn't punk anymore. But it sort of had a punk attitude, and so you could still listen to it without being too embarrassed. And in the mid '80s, what they call the big hair bands started up in LA, like Poison and Motley Crue and Van Halen. They're introducing more or less what they would call heavy metal music, and that became hugely popular to a certain group of people, hugely commercially popular. Um, Later on, probably the biggest band to come out of there would be Van Halen. In the late '80s would be Guns N' Roses. Um, Later on, in the '90s would be Metallica. That came out of the Bay Area, and they were promoting a hedonism sort of. Their lyrics are always about having parties, getting laid, not having any kind of moral boundaries, if that's a good way to put it. A lot of hedonism out there. And then underneath all that, there were some meaningful bands that came out of there that made darker, more meaningful music, like Television and the Talking Heads and Lou Reed and Jeffrey Lee Pierce and his Gun Club. Um, and it had a lasting impact on the world. The 90s started with these bands in Seattle like Soundgarden and Alice in Chains and Nirvana. Uh, and they called it grunge because it was a combination of punk and heavy metal mixed with melodic melodies like the Beatles. Really, Nirvana, his Kurt Cobain's one of his main influences, the Beatles. Um, that's why his songs are so melodic and beautiful and hard and soft and grungy. But there was a dark scene in Seattle. Lots of, not just because of the rain, but because of the heroin use, and it was very chic. Alice in Chains, that's what he sang about all the time. Screaming Trees, that's what they sang about. Kurt was always singing about the pain in his stomach and how to relieve it. Um, and after as the decade wore on, those became very popular band. They sold millions of copies. Soundgarden, they did great. Alice in Chains, um, girl groups like L7, which didn't come out of Seattle but were considered kind of female grunge, and Babes in Toyland, Bikini Kill. There's a women's movement they called Riot Girls with a bunch of R's. And those bands are popular. Babes in Toyland, L7, Bikini Kill. Women were finally thrashing it out on the guitars, just like the men. Hole with Courtney Love, Kurt Cobain's wife, producing what I feel, and not just me, but the critics, people out there writing about it, was the last great rock and roll band era that we've ever experienced. After Kurt killed himself, Alice in Chains lead singer OD'd on heroin. Chris Connolly killed himself. That was years later. Mark Lonigan from Screaming Trees finally died. All the great singers from those bands are all gone, all of them. But they're still out there, and their attitudes are out there. Um, Smashing Pumpkins was a part of all that. And these people, they sang intricate melodic songs, heavy guitar driven songs with a lot of melody and a lot of feeling. And then after the 90s wore down, we were kind of didn't know where we were going. Hip hop and rap had become popular in the inner cities in LA, Detroit, New York. Bands like um, like the first earlier bands, Run DMC, which were kind of they're funny, uh, turned into serious movies. And I asked you to write about one of them, the Wu Tang uh, Clan, Ice T, Ice, all the Ices, Ice T and Ice Cube, their bands singing rough inner city anti cop sentiments became popular. The dance grooves became popular. It's still popular now. People like Tupac Shakur came out of there. He was murdered for his passion There was still a lot of gang activities around the rappers. They were the real deal. Other rappers like Eminem and 50 Cent somehow survived it, made money, made movies, and it became the soundtrack to really the millennials, I would say, the people born in 2000 and on. Still very popular, still going strong. There's people like, they're still out there. Snoop Dogg and P. Diddy and the rest are rapping and telling people their stories, and people are relating to it, the listening. And so, but rock is sort of dead now, for sure. There's an underground out there. I go to rock concerts all the time. They're still out there, smaller venues. People are still banging their heads against the wall. Headbangers, they used to call that, and with loud guitars and distortion and screaming lyrics about your passion, your depression, your happiness, your joy. It's a great outlet. Music has been everything in my life besides film. Those two things, literature would be a third one, painting would be a fourth one. Those That's it for me when it comes to the arts. And punk is in everything I do and think, and I don't mean the music, I'm talking about the attitude. I consider punk an attitude of being authentic to your truth and not being insincere. Um, and so that's going to wrap down my thing on music. I'll wrap it up on Monday if everybody's around. School gets over soon, and I don't want to bore you guys with any more arts. But if anybody wants to get a hold of me, you know how, they're xhaus@yahoo.com, or text me 530-941-9661. It's been great, guys. I'll talk to you next week. This is just the beginning. See you next time.